Welcome to the Phosphorus Podcast, brought to you by the Global Phosphorus Institute, the gateway to fascinating world of phosphorus and its profound impact in our lives, agriculture, and the environment. I'm your host, Jihan Zian, and together we embark on a journey of discovery, education, and inspiration. In this podcast series, we are proud to bring you the latest insights about phosphorus and research-based knowledge about the topic, a vital element that often goes unnoticed in our daily lives, but plays a critical role in a global agriculture and food security. Today, we have the privilege of welcoming a distinguished guest who brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise on the matter. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Terry Roberts, former president of the International Plant Nutrition Institute of the United States. He has 30 years experience as a soil scientist and agronomist working in the global fertilizer industry. Could you please tell us a little bit more about your background, your work, and your connection to the world of phosphorus?
Yes. I grew up in southern Alberta in Canada, and my family was in the retail fertilizer business. And so I had the opportunity to be around agriculture and fertilizers growing up as a young man. When I went to college, I went to the University of Saskatchewan and got a degree in crop science, and then ended up getting a graduate degree, my PhD in soil fertility and plant nutrition. And as part of my PhD work, I studied phosphorus along with sulfur and other nutrients. And so I began my career trying to understand phosphorus and how it behaves in the soil. After school, I started to work with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, working on some fertilizer projects. And from there, I was hired by the Potash and Phosphate Institute as their Western Canada director. So PPI, the Potash and Phosphate Institute, was the predecessor to the International Plant Nutrition Institute. So I began my career working with them, and after a few years I got transferred from Western Canada to our headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, where I started to work internationally. And our programs at IPNI were focused on improving plant nutrition globally around the world. And so that was where I got exposure to Africa. I've had the opportunity to work in Africa for about 15 plus years of my career when we began our programs in Africa. So I've had a long background looking at fertilizer, how we can improve fertilizer management, and how we can improve agronomy to try and alleviate food security, but at the same time to help farmers grow more crops to become more profitable.
Oh, that's a very impressive background, and I'm super excited to have you to share your knowledge and expertise on the matter. The first question is concerning the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations that estimated that more than 278 million Africans, or put it broadly, 20% of the population here in Africa, are undernourished in their 2022 report. How does phosphorus improve people's nutrition in Africa, and are there nuances not captured in the official report?
Phosphorus is critical to human health. It's present in every cell in your body. It plays a critical role in all of our physiological processes in the body. It's part of our bones and our teeth. It's part of our DNA. How we get energy in our bodies is all derived from phosphorus. Our bodies actually contain about 1.4% phosphorus, and that's the highest element in our body outside of calcium. So it is critical to us. The way we get phosphorus in our bodies is through our diet. It's through the foods we eat. Protein-rich foods, meats, poultry, fish are all rich in phosphorus. And as we eat those, we get phosphorus into our diets. We also can get phosphorus in plant-based foods, in legumes, in seeds, but they do not contain as much phosphorus as protein-based foods. So we get phosphorus in our diets by what we eat. And that is part of the challenge in Africa, is Africa is deficient in phosphorus. The soils in Africa, almost all of the soils in Africa, do not have much phosphorus in them. As a result, the plants we grow in Africa are deficient in phosphorus. The animals that eat the feed that we grow in Africa are low in phosphorus. And so the challenge in Africa is to get more phosphorus into the human diet. And the only way we can do that is to address the problem with phosphorus in Africa soils. The basis of human life really comes from soil, and that is the challenge. The FAO State of Food Security reports that are put out each year, they point out the issues. They contain great statistics about the challenge that we face. This 20% of the population of Africa is undernourished. But the reports themselves don't provide a lot of information about the solutions to the problems. How do we address the problems? They discuss very high-level solutions of improvements in technology and things that people can do, but that doesn't help the African farmer, the smallholder who's trying to produce a higher yield of corn, a higher yield of maize, with a higher quality in that maize. And so that report is wonderful, but it is not intended, I think, to solve the problems at the ground level among the smallholder farmers in Africa.
So what would you have to suggest for solutions potentially for the report to add, like some specific things that needed to be added, that a report that can help, as you said, the small holders as well as the big holders when it comes to bigger initiatives?
Well, you have to look at who the audience of the report is. The FAO is addressing things at a very high level. It's not intended, I think, to solve solutions on the ground. And so it does a good job of pointing out the problems and the issues and drawing attention to the fact that there's tremendous undernourishment in Africa. It just doesn't address how do we solve that problem. In general, it says we need to really increase food production. But how do we do that? That's the question that we face. And the report itself is very lengthy, but it doesn't get into the details. I think that has to happen in other places, and it has to happen on the ground in Africa. And there are organizations that are trying to address those concerns. In Africa, we have the African Plant Nutrition Institute.
So, how significant is the contribution of climate change, agricultural policies, and other factors?
Let's first talk about highly weathered soils and what they are. These are soils that are often found in tropical and subtropical areas. They've undergone extensive weathering over long periods of time. And as a result, the chemical composition in the soils have changed. It's been altered. A lot of the nutrients in the soil, which are essential to grow crops, things like calcium, magnesium, potassium, and even phosphorus, are leached out of the soil, or they're leached below the rooting zone where the crops can access them. So as a result, they have very low nutrient content. They also have very low organic matter content, which is essential to soil health. These soils also tend to be very rich in iron and aluminum oxides. When you have a lot of iron oxides in your soils become red in color, a rusty or a yellowy color, and that indicates that there's a lot of iron oxides in the soil. And so when you have soils like that, it changes the structure of the soil and the texture of the soil, and it complicates how we manage them. And so because of the weathering in a lot of African soils, they're challenging to work with. They have low nutrients and very low organic matter. So when we talk about the impact of climate change on African soils, climate change itself has had very little impact on these highly weathered soils in Africa. The weathering of these soils has taken place over hundreds of years. And climate change is really an erratic and changing rainfall, it's changing temperatures, it's affecting our growing season. So we have higher temperatures and often water shortages. Or during the raining season, it's changed the pattern of rains during the raining season. And it causes problems with loss of biodiversity, and it impacts the crops that we can grow. But climate change itself doesn't directly impact the phosphorus challenge that we're facing in phosphorus, or that we're facing in Africa. We still need better phosphorus management. That will help offset the impact of climate change. When you apply phosphorus fertilizer, or you can apply organic materials to the soil that are rich in phosphorus, they will help increase crop yields. They will make crop yields more stable. If you can increase crop yields, you're going to produce more organic material. There's more roots in the ground, there's more litter material or crop residues produced, which help build soil organic matter. It improves the health of the soil. And as you do that, you will naturally be able to improve productivity. You'll be able to have a more stable condition to fight against these changing climates that we're experiencing all over the world. So phosphorus is critical to producing more organic matter in our soils, to producing higher yields. If you look at the agricultural policies that are in effect around the world and in Africa especially, they can have a large impact. So we're talking about phosphorus management and 4R nutrient stewardship. One of the challenges with managing phosphorus in our soils is that phosphorus is an immobile nutrient. It moves very little in the soil. In contrast, when you apply nitrogen in the soil, nitrogen moves freely with the soil water. So it's much easier for the roots of a plant to access it. With phosphorus, it never moves more than a few millimeters from a plant root. And so you have to place the phosphorus close to where the roots are. So as part of 4R nutrient management, we want to be very careful as to how we place our phosphorus in the soil. Ideally, we want to put it close to the roots, not on the soil surface, but close to where the roots are going to grow and access it. And so for African farmers, if they can place a small amount of phosphorus by the seed in the soil when they plant their crop, that is the best way to place their phosphorus. They need to know how much phosphorus they need. That is a big challenge. And so the phosphorus that you apply to the soil is going to determine by how much can the soil naturally supply, its inherent soil fertility. So we need to have an assessment of the soil's nutrient supplying capacity, and then we need to know how much the crop needs. And how much the crop need really depends on the yield. So an African farmer needs to have a good idea of how much yield he can produce. If the soil and the climatic conditions, if you have enough, well, phosphorus has to be used together with other plant nutrients because they interact together. And we need to apply the right amount that we need. We don't want too much. We need to put it where the crop can access it. If you just put phosphorus on the soil surface, it could be lost through erosion. When the heavy rains come, it just washes everything off the soil surface. So we need to put it in the soil. We need to put it on the right rate and put it when we plant our crops. Those are the main management decisions that farmers need to make when they're using their phosphorus. So it needs to be managed carefully, but it's not difficult. They just need help understanding why they would manage it the way that they need to manage it.
So education and learn a little bit more about phosphorus for farmers here in Africa is the main objective and the main solution if we want to have the one-on-one discussion with them.
Education and training are critical, but farmers still need to be able to access fertilizer. So the logistics of providing fertilizer across Africa is a challenge in many areas, and the price. Often farmers pay more for phosphorus fertilizer in Africa than a U.S. farmer would pay in the Corn Belt. And that is really because of logistics once it gets to the country. It's expensive to transport it.
Next question, Dr. Terry, is how does phosphorus fertilizer behave in highly weathered soils compared to non-weathered soils?
When you apply phosphorus fertilizer to the soil, you can imagine a small granule or a prill of fertilizer. When that granule of phosphorus gets into the soil, it gradually dissolves. Water from the soil comes in and causes it to dissolve, and the phosphate ions in that granule go out into the surrounding soil surface, and they interact with the other elements, the other ions that are there. In highly weathered soils, I explained that they're rich in iron and aluminum. In non-weathered soils, they're rich in calcium and magnesium. And so in highly weathered soils, as the phosphorus granules dissolve, those phosphate ions interact with either iron and aluminum, or in a non-weathered soil with calcium or magnesium. When they interact with iron and aluminum, it tends to fix them very tightly in less available forms. The iron and aluminum holds that phosphorus and binds it very tight. In a non-weathered soil, which has a lot of calcium in it, it also binds with those phosphorus ions, but it's not as tightly held as in a highly weathered soil. Now, this isn't irreversible. This phosphorus will still gradually become available, but it takes time, and by time I'm talking years and years, as phosphorus goes through a natural cycle, a biogeochemical type cycle. So normally when you're fertilizing phosphorus in highly weathered soils, you're going to have to put on more phosphorus. Plants only need so much, and if we just talk about phosphorus efficiency for a minute, if you were to apply phosphorus to the soil in the year that you apply it and that the plants take it up, only 10 to 15% of what you apply will be taken up that year. So that's considered a pretty low efficiency. However, the phosphorus doesn't move in the soil. It tends to stay where you put it. For the most part, it doesn't leach because it's attracted to the other minerals that are present in the soil. And so phosphorus will slowly become available to the plant for many years after. And so it has a residual capacity. We talk about legacy P as something that you still get long-term effects from applying phosphorus fertilizer. So in highly weathered soils, the phosphorus that you put on as fertilizer is tied up by iron and aluminum. These tend to make the phosphorus less available to plants, but it will be slowly available over the next 10, 15, 20 years. But initially you have to put on higher amounts of phosphorus fertilizer. So that is one of the challenges of managing phosphorus in highly weathered soils, is it's tightly bound to this iron and aluminum. The other problem in highly weathered soils, when you leach out the calcium and magnesium and you have a lot of aluminum in the soils, it makes the pH of the soils become acidic. Okay, so we have to manage the pH. So let me just add a few comments about technology related to phosphorus management. We talked about 4R nutrient stewardship and how it's important to use the right source of phosphorus. And with the highly weathered soils in Africa, if you could slow the release of phosphorus as these granules are put in the soil, slow how that they interact with the iron and aluminum oxides present, that will help increase phosphorus availability. There are available fertilizer products that are coated in polymers or other substances which slow the release of phosphorus. Those, I think, would be difficult for African farmers to access, and they're more expensive than regular phosphorus. Typical phosphorus sources of fertilizer would be diammonium phosphate or monoammonium phosphate or triple superphosphate. And so those are the normal products that African farmers have to use. Often in Africa, the fertilizers come together in a compound or a complex granule. In other words, one granule would contain some nitrogen, some phosphorus, and some potassium. It could be a 10-10-10. 10% nitrogen, 10% P2O5, 10% K2O. And that's what the farmer has to access. And so, because he has limited access to a variety of sources, he has a limited ability to tailor the fertilizer source that he's using to exactly what the crop needs. One of the technologies that are taking place in Africa right now, because there's not a lot of soil testing available in Africa, is to try and use other ways to test soils. Remote sensing, for example. We can use spectral imaging to analyze the soil to determine its nutrient content. And so that is a technology that is being used in Africa to try and help map soils. That's one of the reasons that we know that almost 90% of the soils in Africa are deficient in phosphorus. It's from this imagery that is being used. What we don't know is how effective that imagery is in being able to relate it to how much phosphorus you need to add to a crop to grow it. So that is kind of a technology gap. But it's exciting about this spectral imaging and this remote sensing to use that as a tool, because it leapfrogs over soil testing.
A very important thing to discuss, as we noticed throughout the podcast and your intervention, is to be able to let the farmers here in Africa to have access to those technologies and to education in the beginning, which is not, if we compare it to, for instance, farmers in the United States or in Canada, they do have access more to those resources. I think that is one issue that we can discuss when it comes to phosphorus management.
Yes, this whole issue of accessibility of fertilizer, of technologies, of information are all important to smallholder farmers in Africa. And a lot of the accessibility is driven by access to finance. African farmers need to be able to access credit. Other farmers around the world use credit to purchase their fertilizer, their seed, their equipment, all the inputs that they need. They grow their crops. When they harvest and sell their crops, then they can pay off their credit, pay off the bank loans. So I don't think a lot of African farmers have access to good credit. I'm aware that there are programs in Africa and groups that are trying to provide microfinancing to a smallholder farmer to allow them to borrow the money that they need to buy their seed, to get a crop in the ground, which they can then pay back. Fertilizing in Africa is always a risk. It's a risk everywhere in the world, but it's a risk in Africa, partly because of climate change. When you invest a lot of money in fertilizer, the only way that you can recover your investment is to produce more yield of your crop. So if you fertilize your crop and then the rains don't come, or you put on more fertilizer than there's enough water to grow the crop that you need, you're not going to get the return that you want. If you put on too much fertilizer early in the growing season without supporting rain, the crop will get off to a great start. It'll use up all of the available moisture that's in the soil, and then it'll die before the rains come to keep it going. So there's risk involved in farming. There's risk involved in fertilizer management. A lot of farmers around the world in developed agriculture in North America and in Europe have access to crop insurance to help offset some of these risks that are inherent. Farmers in the Corn Belt have the same risks in terms of moisture. If there's a drought, they're not going to get a return on their investment in their fertilizers. But the smallholder in Africa has a much greater risk than other farmers do, because of the challenges that they face. Phosphorus is one of those challenges.
It is a very interesting question, and we did discuss the difference between soils and management of phosphorus in agriculture in different states, whether that be in Africa or in the America and Europe. Are there any successful phosphorus management cases in highly weathered soils from other parts of the world, and how can we adapt them to the African context?
So Africa isn't the only continent in the world that has highly weathered soils. We see highly weathered soils in Brazil. There are highly weathered soils in the southeast United States. Currently I live in Georgia. We have soils, our soils in Georgia are red, they're low pH, they're highly weathered. Same thing in Brazil, but we can manage these soils to become very, very productive soils. I think Africa has the same potential. When I first started working in Africa, over 15 years ago, I was involved in a project in Mozambique. And what we were trying to do was increase maize yields. And the other partners in this project were the IFDC, the International Fertilizer Development Center, IFA, the International Fertilizer Association, and the Fertilizer Institute, or the Sulfur Institute, I should say, and IPNI. And we went into this area and we were comparing farmer practice, which was no or very little fertilizer, and they were using saved seed, so homegrown seed. They'd save seed from the crop they grew this year to plant next year. And we were comparing that with using a soil test-based fertilizer practice with balanced fertilizer and using better quality seed, open pollinated varieties of seed or hybrid seed. And we did this in 5 regions, kind of along the Beira corridor in Mozambique, and with 5 different villages. So these villages had anywhere from 70 to 150 smallholder farmers in them. And we were able to very quickly demonstrate that we could take their yields from about 0.6 tons of maize per hectare to over 5 tons of maize per hectare, simply by managing the fertilizer. So several hundred farmers became sold on the value of fertilizer. They loved that they could increase their yields that much. When we were done the project, the challenge that they had was accessing the fertilizer, because they just couldn't get the same fertilizers that we were able to use. And so that is often a challenge in Africa.
Thanks again for this insightful conversation. We learned a lot more about how to manage phosphorus in weathered soils, but also in non-weathered soils. We learned a lot about the importance of accessibility and make it more efficient for big farmers, but also smaller farmers in the scale of Morocco and Africa in general. Thank you again for your expertise, your discussions. Thank you for our listeners and audience for listening, and remember that phosphorus is a vital element in our lives, not just simply in our nutrition, but also it's part of our body and part of our culture in general. So I hope that this podcast has been insightful, and we'll see you in the next one.